So today we are going to look at this construct of content-based language assessment. When I looked at, the theme of the webinar as content-based instruction, so I thought this session where we look at the concept of assessment in content-based instruction would be useful for teachers. So therefore, I have prepared my presentation in such a manner that for most of the teachers, I hope that there would be some takeaways. So I would take around 50 minutes, 45 to 50 minutes for my presentation, and thereafter I would welcome questions from the audience. So this would be the overview of today's presentation. So it would be divided into two parts. In the first part, I would problematize the concept of English language pedagogy with respect to the Indian context, vis-a-vis the global, trends of looking at English, English medium instruction, so on and so forth. Then we would look at the integral features of this concept of content and language integrated learning. So I'm sure since the webinar began yesterday, you would have a lot of sessions regarding the concept of content-based instruction, content and language integrated learning. So it would fit into all that discussion. And then in the second part of my presentation, I would be looking at the concept, the core concept of content-based language assessment, and what are some of the principles that we as teachers need to keep in mind, followed by an actual example of assessment, which I would draw from, the common European framework of reference, the current one. So the original one was published in 2001, and the current one was there is a new version which is from the year 2020, and it is freely downloadable from their website. So I would be referring to that in order to show you how to design an example content-based language assessment and how to prepare the rubrics, and then we would look at how we can strike a balance between content and language. So let us look at the first part. Right. So if we look at language teaching pedagogies, which has had a rich history in education, and when we think of education, and more specifically language education, we cannot but think of the pedagogical approaches that could be applied. So if we think of the Indian context, for example, starting from the pre-colonial days to the recent times, we are confronted with this concept of, English, the role English has played in pedagogy for ages to come. It would be like almost 100 years, starting from the Macaulay's Minutes to the recent controversy in some of the states, which are asking every government school to become English medium school, to a kind of a conflict that is there in other states also. So some of the states have kind of have this bandwagon that English medium instruction should be started from grade 1, versus some of the states are still considering whether English should be a subject, and then the medium of instruction should be included after grade 5 according to the stipulations of NEP, so on and so forth. So there is a lot of confusion, there is a lot of conflict with the role of English in the classroom context. So if we consider the teaching of English globally, then at different points of time of history, because of various factors, linguistic, cognitive, psychological, that different pedagogical approaches have come to the forefront. They have gained popularity, and then they have over a period of time they have not been so popular, and new approaches have taken. So one of the approaches that has been quite popular since a very long time, I'm sure many of you are aware of this, the direct method, where we only use the target language to teach the target language. So this is like a monolingual approach to teach English. And though this kind of an approach has been fairly successful in the Western context, where there is a lot of English environment outside of the classroom as well, but it has not been that successful in multilingual contexts of Asia and Africa. And the simple reason being for that is that English might not be available outside of the classroom context. So this gives rise to a lot of dichotomy, that how do we help our learners acquire the target language which is not available to them in a naturalistic manner. So this has given way to a lot of discussion, debate, and bi and multilingual education have emerged from Canada and later spread to the European Union and many parts of Asia and Africa. So the positive impact of using bilingual, multilingual education, though it originated from the West, but it still finds a lot of use in our context, because we do not disregard the resources, the linguistic resources that the learners bring to the class. So in India, although the direct method has been quite popular in several pockets, and it has yielded mixed results. So we cannot say that it is not successful, or we cannot say that it is successful. And this has paved the path to teach English in the, for quite some time. That it's not a new method, but we have been following the bilingual method or bilingual approach to language teaching. Or more recently, we are using the concept of translanguaging pedagogy. So what happens is it might not be available at the policy level or at the administrative level. So on the face of it, the school might be considered officially English medium of instruction, but then teachers at a local level, they resort to using learners L1 resources, and therefore make the transaction of knowledge easier. So this has been there for quite some time, but the concept of translanguaging pedagogy is gaining importance, over a period of time. So where does content fit in language teaching? Can we bring in the concept of content in language teaching? So along with the medium of instruction, this construct of content has deeply influenced English language education, because it is a conscious move from teaching the language for its own sake, that we teach the language through the language, versus using it to teach content and thereby improve proficiency in the target language. So this has given rise to the concept of CLIL, content and language integrated learning, but it also, has had an Indian version, namely language across the curriculum. So the features completely do not overlap. So today's discussion, we will be looking at, CLIL and its approach or its, implication for assessment, how it can be looked at in terms of the core principles of CLIL. Right. So language across the curriculum is like an Indian avatar of CLIL. So there is some amount of overlap, though all the features do not completely overlap. So what is CLIL? So this content and language integrated learning, it originated, as I said, in the European settings during the 1960s, and it has a dual purpose. So if you look at the diagram here, so it has the learning of L2, where the medium of instruction is L2 or the target language. Here we can consider it as English, and then learning of the subject matter. So then it serves dual purposes, that we look at proficiency development as well as content knowledge development. And it was, when it originated, it had the concept of, it originated within the model of bilingual education program. And later, it also, like when it came to India, so the concept of CLIL that we have in India is, as I said, that language across the curriculum or using English medium of instruction. And so by that, teachers and parents would look at it as that their learners are getting more amount of English because it is also the medium of instruction in other classroom settings. However, there is a very great challenge to CLIL, that when we wish to apply the CLIL model or the EMI model, language teachers may also have to develop their own knowledge of new subjects in order to teach effectively. So what we aim for is that we bring in content into the language classroom, but that presupposes that language teachers have some amount of content knowledge. So an English teacher would be expected to have knowledge of, let's say, EVS or history or geography in order to use those content in the language classroom, and vice versa, that subject teachers would need to have some awareness about the target language to see how the target language is being learned through the content. So it works both ways, and there are challenges that the teachers face. So role of content in language teaching, there are a couple of opportunities which I have listed. It's not a comprehensive list, but it looks at most of the important features. So the content matter gives the teacher an authentic set of materials that they can use to develop the academic language proficiency of the learners, which is actually quite, I mean, we have this, kind of a misunderstanding that when we wish to develop our the communicative competence of our learners, that it is like a holistic concept. But then the academic language use of the target language versus its communicative use are slightly different. And in the school context, the teacher has a lot of capacity to develop the academic language, which is not available outside of the classroom. Right. So for academic language proficiency to develop in the classroom, CLIL model provides a very good context. So if you wish to refer to this in further detail, you could look up Cummins 2017 for a discussion. And language teachers, as I said, need to develop content knowledge, right? So that's an opportunity from a few disciplines. But this is somewhat similar to English for specific purposes, but the syllabus can be more general. It need not be as, constrained or narrow as in an ESP course, where an ESP course for doctors or nurses would revolve only around that theme of medicine or, medical profession. So the approach created an avenue for deep learning of the language, because the learners would revisit the learning of the language across different classrooms, which would be available as content subjects, right? And they would learn to develop their language skills, like, for example, summarize texts from history lessons or EVS lessons. So what it means, in a very simple manner, is that the language teacher uses a lot of academic content in his or her class, and likewise, the content teachers uses some language features in their class to see the development of the content knowledge as well as language knowledge. So that is the challenge. So, and in this, there is a wonderful, avenue that learners and teachers can be co-creators or co-agents of learning and its assessment. So in the Indian context, CLI can be largely understood that, as I said, through the version of the educational model of English medium of instruction. And although it is followed all throughout in the higher education and is being increasingly adopted in primary, secondary, and tertiary education, but the level of success or the level of ethicality of its use in the primary, secondary, and tertiary education is quite a questionable issue. But however, in most higher education domains, English is the medium of instruction, and therefore what I thought is I will pitch it at the level of teachers, and I'm sure all of you are teachers, or most of you are teachers and researchers, where you would be able to look at the EMI in the context of higher education. So undergraduate level, postgraduate level, research, teaching, so on and so forth. However, although it has a lot of opportunities, there are quite a few prominent challenges that we need to be aware of before we adopt this, scheme and move on to looking at the concept of assessment. So teaching in a content that learners are not proficient enough can have a negative impact. So this is what research shows. And this is why I said that using this model at the primary and secondary level without ensuring that learners have a threshold level proficiency can have other, negative impacts. And that is from the learner's point of view. From the teacher's point of view, since the teaching of the content is in the target language, many content teachers have been found to struggle with their proficiency. This is something that Irina was presenting in her, paper. I happen to be a part of that as well in that presentation. So yeah, so the teachers struggle with their proficiency, and therefore it would be very challenging for them to teach concepts, elaborate upon concepts using the target language or the EMI. So teaching content only through the target language may not be beneficial for majority of the Indian learners at the primary and secondary levels, and therefore we need to resort to the learners L1 resources. However, in today's presentation, I'm not looking at problematizing the use of CLIL or content-based instruction in the primary or secondary levels, but I'm pitching it at the level of teachers, teacher educators, and undergraduate, postgraduate, and research scholars. So what is the way forward for us? So as teachers of language and content in English, where do we stand? How do we seek advantage of this model and ensure better learning in a multilingual country like India? So we cannot wish away the multilingual, context, and we should not do that. So on one hand, CLIL as a model is a direct threat to the multilingual context, but we can turn it around and see how in the multilingual context like India, we can use the CLIL, model, but keeping the learners L1 resources in mind. Right. So English language pedagogy has been conceptualized in the Western context and Asian, Indian, African context to different approaches. So this is like a continuum. This diagram is like a continuum where we look at the focus on content on one hand through English and focus on language for its own sake. So we have the EMI or the English medium instruction, immersion, CLIL, which has the focus on content as well as language. And then we slowly move on where programs look at more focus on language. So English for specific purposes, English in the FL or SL context and things like that. So as I said, that when we look at CLIL, for example, teacher education courses like B.Ed, M.Ed, research in English language education, these are all valid contexts to understand the application of CLIL in a very robust manner in the Indian context. And along with that, we might have to also use L1 resources as and when required, depending on the threshold level proficiency of our learner groups, both in the target language as well as their L1 resources. Right, now let us slowly move into the concept of assessment. So when we look at English teaching and assessment, the tricky part is what we teach and what we assess and the medium of instruction are the same. But that is not the case in a geography class or in a social sciences class or in pure sciences classes, where the content is very distinct and the medium of instruction is separate. When we think of the CLIL model, however, the medium of instruction also becomes a point of examination. So we are looking at language and we are looking at content, but the content is expressed through the language. So that is the tricky part, right? So on one hand, we have the medium of instruction and another, we have the second language or the foreign language classroom. So that is where we have to think of the role of content in language assessment. So therefore, we have this construct, content-based language assessment. So the primary understanding of this model of assessment is that we have to look at the content assessment as well as language assessment. So it's a healthy mix of both, and how we can attain that is something that we will look at through the next part of the presentation. So when we look at the concept of language teaching and assessment in the classroom context, and today's discussion, I am only looking at classroom-based assessment and not high-stakes examination. And the reason being that, teachers are the ones who are agents of change, and teachers and learners can be co-creators of knowledge and assessment. So therefore, the classroom provides a rich avenue for the teachers and the learners to understand the complementary processes of teaching and assessment. And I am looking at, teacher-led assessments like achievement tests that the teachers can conduct on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, and how that promotes the concept of learning. Right? It furthers the learning process. So we have the teaching of content and proficiency, or both. And so that means that we have instructional inputs on the basis of which the teachers can have cycles of achievement testing and assessment. So it leads to testing and assessment. And then there is a scope for the teachers to give feedback to the learners, as well as get feedback from the learners, through their performance evidence. Right? So the teaching moves on to assessment, and then there is feedback, and then the teacher can make instructional adjustments, and then again there could be instructional input. So it goes on in a reiterative cyclical manner. Right? So we create the condition for assessment for classroom purposes. So where we support the learning through the assessment, right? So assessment is not only of learning, but we support the learning through the assessment process. So that is the spirit of, classroom-based assessment and assessment for classroom purposes. Right. So teachers have to, always are confronted with these two potentially competing goals. One is that of the immediate goal, that where the learner should reach at the end of a year, academic year, at the end of a course, at the end of a semester. So helping the learners attain a certain score or a grade, which indicates the ability level of the learner at that point of time. So that's the immediate goal that the teachers, are confronted with. However, teachers also need to somewhere keep in mind that there is a long-term goal, that by way of achieving the immediate goals over a period of time, the learners would reach at a stable state of knowledge and language proficiency, right? So the long-term goal, although the teacher might not be able to see a learner 5 years from when the teacher would have, interacted with a particular learner, but then this would have an impact on the learner life, right? So there are always two, potentially competing goals, that of the immediate goal and the long-term goal. And the teacher is at the center point with the assessment tools that the teacher uses in order to track learning and development. So now let us look at the concept of language tests and assessment. So if we think of language tests and assessment, there are two models that the teachers have in hand. One is that of achievement test. So achievement test is here, where the teacher has a set of instructional inputs, and then there is an assessment at the end of it. So every unit there is an assessment cycle. So that is what is the model of achievement testing or assessment. And then versus we have, proficiency tests like IELTS, TOEFL, or for jobs many a times, or let's say now if you think of the CUET exams, right? So that has a proficiency component and a content component. Right. So teachers usually use achievement tests and assessments quite a lot, but many a times they might have to also design and use proficiency tests and assessments, right? So what lies in the core of language testing and assessment? We have these sub-skills or sub-features. So we have the 4 skills, listening, speaking, which are the oral skills, reading, writing, the written skills, and then we can, have the dimension of reception versus production. So receptive skills would be listening and reading, whereas production would be speaking and writing. I'm sure all of you are very much aware of this, right? So this is just to recap what we need to look at when we think of the concept of language assessment. So on one hand, we have the skills and their sub-skills, and then we have the language features or the elements like grammar, phonology, orthography, right, and vocabulary. So these 3 components are the elements or the raw material with which the language is built. Yes, and when we wish to use these features or a combination of these features in our, assessment design, we need to be alert, and we need to have the awareness that the Common European Framework of Reference, or the CEFR, gives us good descriptors across 6 levels, and we should be able to pick and choose from those and adapt it or adopt it to our contexts as required. So teachers also need this awareness that there are band descriptors and how they can be, made into measurable constructs for my classroom needs. Right. So as I said, that achievement tests and assessments are the ones which we as teachers used most frequently and almost on a daily or a weekly basis. So on one hand, they have the formative role that they help in tracking learning over a period of time. And we could also look at it as a summative role, meaning the end term exam or the end of the year exam, through which the students are given a certification that yes, on the basis of the course that the student or the learner has attended, this is the level of knowledge or this is the level of language proficiency that the learner has reached at. So this is an administrative tool, the summative examination, but it has a lot of practical use, right? So that without the certification, the learner would not be able to apply for a higher level course or a higher level program, isn't it? So it is the summative exam, the scope is not that of a learning tool. It is more for the formative, tests and assessment. But then the summative exam is like a conclusion to the entire, if we look at it as a play in different acts. So it is like the final act. Right. So in evaluation, what we do is we take decisions. So we take decisions of proceeding with the course or promotion of the learners. At times, we can also evaluate certain learning issues as a researcher, as a teacher researcher, do some classroom-based research, convey to the learner and help him or her to work with it in order to progress further, right? So the formative assessments have a lot of scope, both for the learners and the teachers. And as I suggested, it has scope for teacher researchers as well. Right. So are we doing good till now? Are the slides moving? Is my voice audible? I hope I'm not too fast. Any quick?
We are at the right pace, ma'am, and everything is clear and you are doing great, ma'am.
Right. Thank you, Irina. So if anyone from the audience would like to pose any questions, because now I would move into the second part, which is a little more application oriented. So if there are any quick questions, something pressing need, pressing urge that you wish to ask, you can go ahead, unmute yourselves and shoot.
Ma'am, can we use corpora for the design of assessments? The available corpora, so that we can use authentic language for creating assessments. And is there anything we should be wary about in the use of corpora? I mean, how do we figure out the difficulty level and all of that? I mean, I understand it's more practical, but probably you'll discuss it later.
Right. May I know your name, please? Very good question.
My name is Manjima Bhadran.
Right, Manjima. So we will handle that question at the end of the session. Is that fine?
That's fine. That's fine.
Right. Okay. So let's move on. Yeah, so before we move on to the content-based assessment, some basics of assessment that when we look at, a language test or an assessment, we have to think of the minimal unit, right? So the minimal unit in the field of assessment, we call them items. So tests and assessments are constructed on the basis of items. And so the items conceptually are minimal units based on which an assessment tool is designed. Right. So an assessment tool might have an item at times, which is not like it does not get over in a sentence, but it is like a whole task in which the learner is expected to use authentic language in an extended manner. For example, a summary writing task, or for example, a paraphrase writing task, or a written assignment, or a project, right? So that is a task, and the response of the learners is in an extended manner by using the target language in an authentic manner, especially if it is an academic task, right? So the effort that the learner makes in solving the task aids in his language proficiency development. Okay, so this is at the core of the TBLT, or task-based language testing and task-based language assessment approach. And content-based assessment uses this approach quite a lot. So this is one of the ingredients of content-based assessment. Okay, so the items can be discrete, or the items can even look like a task, which is not very different from a teaching task. Okay, so therefore, to understand how items look like, let us quickly look at the 3 types of standardized item types. So we have in the field of assessment, we have 3 item types. So the first one is the fixed response, which we use through binary scoring. So human beings can score them. It can be through OMR sheet, or it can be machine generated, right? So, and the easy part is the creation of such items are difficult because we have to think of options, distractors, so on and so forth. But the checking or the marking of these items are very easy. However, there is a challenge in interpreting the responses in terms of the ability levels, because what we do is we add up the scores. But when we add up the scores out of 100, are we able to place our students on a particular ability level? So that is a pitfall of fixed response items. Right? But because of time, because of other resources, and because of quick decisions, most of the competitive exams you will see that have fixed response items, and because the purpose of those exams is filtration and not learning. However, in the classroom context, when we look at assessment as a learning opportunity, we need not narrow down our scope only for fixed response items. So this is an awareness for the language teachers and content teachers. Right? So we have fixed responses, and then we have the second type, which is limited response item. So in the limited response item, what we do is we push the learner to make some language production in a structured, paradigm. So there is one semantically correct answer, but it can be linguistically expressed in various forms. For example, completing dialogues, where we supply, where the learners are expected to supply with phrases. So the phrases might be, they need not be one correct answer. So in limited response, we do not work with binary scoring. So the evaluation of limited response becomes far more challenging for the teacher. And here, even though in some cases it can be computer assessed, but then most of the times we need human intervention. Okay, and in the third part, we have the free response items or the free response task, where every response will be an individual response based on a particular prompt, like a picture description task, letter writing task, email writing task, essay writing task, so on and so forth. And here the evaluation is the most challenging for the teacher, because neither is it binary, nor is it like within a set of semantically correct answers, but the entire response from learner 1 to learner 2 to learner 3, the linguistic expression would be very different. Though the idea units will be by and large the same, but the expression of it will vary across learners. So how do we deal with this? That on one hand we look at individual differences, and on another we look at the schema of each task, and look for commonalities in the performance. So this is the challenging bit for the teacher, and that is what we will be discussing today when we look at the design of a content-based assessment. So with this knowledge, of the item types, the minimal unit of an assessment design, let us move into the next part of the presentation. So here we will now spend some time, looking at content-based language assessment, some of its principles that we need to be aware of, we need to follow in our design, and how we can apply it. Now, let me clarify this point, that the example and the principles that I would be discussing would be in relation to higher education. Okay, in today's session, it is very difficult for me to, pitch it for the primary level or the secondary level learners. Of course, we can do it, maybe not for the primary level, but secondary level onwards, but that would be part of another discussion. So what we are discussing now would be applicable for teacher education, courses or programs. It could be applicable for undergraduate, postgraduate programs, or for research programs. So therefore, we are narrowing it down. We are narrowing our scope of content-based language assessment for higher education. Right. So in that capacity, we would be discussing the principles. So let us take some time to understand this slide. So it would be applied for, as I said, classroom-based assessment for achievement tests and assessment. Right. So what we do is we adopt the formative feature of assessments, where we constantly think of giving feedback to the learners and thereby helping them move from their current level of performance to a higher level of performance. So it is based on the feedback that the learners receive, and the feedback has to be carefully designed based on the assessment tool and the rubrics of assessment. Okay, so a lot of planning for the teachers. Right. So let us look at the level of assessment. As I said, that the first and foremost thing that the teacher has to identify in order to, create content-based assessment in a content course or in a language course which focuses on content within the EMI model, that we have to consider the level of assessment. So here I'm considering adult learners in graduate programs with proficiency level B2 to C1. Okay, so that is where I have pitched the application of content-based assessment. So to ensure quality in assessment and support growth, okay, so we have twin purposes, that we ensure quality of assessment, that it is good quality assessment, and we wish to support growth in learning of both content and language. We need to be aware of the following principles, and they need to be fulfilled whenever we design content-based assessment. So these are the 5 principles of assessment that any assessor has to look for in his or her tool and the evaluation rubrics. But here I have aligned them to the needs of higher education learners at the B2 to C1 level. Okay, so we have the concept of reliability, where we need to look at the assessment tool and see whether it is aligned to the curricular needs of content in higher education, maybe geography or history or political science. Okay, and be able to design and use task-based assessment rubrics. So this is something that I will be discussing today. And here I would be looking at some pages from CEFR 2020. Right. And then we need to look at the concept of validity, where we need to check that what I'm intending to, assess whether my assessment tool matches that or not. So if I'm intending to assess learners' ability to paraphrase texts, I should not be asking learners to, write an email. So there is a cross between what I am expecting the learners to do and what the tool actually makes them do. Right. So that is the principle of validity. Then the tasks have to be aligned authenticity, the principle of authenticity, that the tasks have to be aligned to what the learners are expected to do in higher education, like, writing summaries, writing critical reviews, writing position papers, writing essays, academic essays, things like that. So if we choose such tasks and if we choose texts from content classes, that will make the assessment tool authentic. Then we have to also look at the principle of practicality, that we cannot just get lost in translation of time and human resources. We have to take into account that if we are teaching 50 learners at one point of time, how do we make the assessment in such a manner that it will not have a lot of impact, negative impact on the amount of time taken and the amount of human resources I need to involve. Right? So that's attending to the principle of practicality. And then lastly, washback, that I should also be able to predict, that in the future, this kind of an assessment tool should not create a fear or, some kind of anxiety in the learners. That would have a negative impact or negative washback. So although it is very difficult for a teacher when he or she is designing a tool to predict what kind of an impact it has, but a quick way of doing that is of ensuring that, is to have some interviews with your learners with regard to their opinion about your assessment tool. That you will have to, be open to criticism, not from the higher ones up in the administration or your peers or colleagues, but from your learners. And over a period of time, you will gain an understanding what works well with your learners. And it can help them, also work with such assessment tools in future. It's very difficult. I'm sure it might sound a little abstract to you at this point, but this is like an orientation for the teacher. Okay, and content-based assessment also uses these two concepts in a very integrative manner. One is learning-oriented assessment. So if you look at the concept of reliability, that whatever we choose for the assessment design has to be closely aligned to the curricular needs of the learner. So it is learning-oriented assessment and not assessment of learning. Right? And we can also use some of the features of TBLT. So I'm not going into details. Maybe some of you have some idea about the TBLT approach. In case you don't, we could always look for some resources. Right. So now let us look at how to design a content-based assessment. You as a teacher or as a researcher, what are the things that you need to keep in mind? How do you need to follow the steps? What can be the raw material of that design, and how can you proceed with administering that tool? Okay, so the example that I would be using would be an example for B2 level from the CEFR, and it is an example of integrated assessment of reading and speaking. Okay, so first let us look at what to include. Right? So we have to think of the construct of assessment, or what to include, how to operationalize it. So integrated assessment of reading and speaking. So I'm not looking at writing, I'm not looking at listening, I'm not looking at vocabulary, but I'm looking at a receptive skill, reading, and I'm looking at a production skill, speaking. And these are related to the curricular needs of the learners, that they need to read a lot of academic texts, they need to participate in discussion, they need to participate in certain presentations and things like that. So this is related to their curricular needs and their profile as a researcher or as a learner in higher education. Okay, the next challenge is we have to identify the theme and relevant text and check its level of difficulty according to the CEFR levels. Okay, CEFR levels of descriptors. Then we could also look for its lexical difficulty, sentence structure. So it depends, what you are able to manage as a teacher. Okay, so we need to identify the theme and the relevant text, and very soon I will show you one example. Then we can, once we have identified the text, what we can do is, these are some of the softwares which will auto-generate some results for you. Okay, and give you an indication where the text stands in terms of difficulty. So I have used CEFR checker, for example, to identify the level of difficulty of the text that I have used in my assessment. Okay, and that's how I have understood that it is from the B2 level. Okay, and then we need to go back to our, item menu, fixed response, limited response, and free response, and select types of items that can be used for reading assessment and for speaking assessment, because it's an integrated, assessment. So reading will lead to speaking. So speaking is not tested or assessed in a standalone manner. Okay, and reading, mind you, is not going to be tested through MCQ, which is fixed response. So we will not be doing that. So what we will be doing is using a text map, okay, or a mind map to understand what has been comprehended from the entire text, right? And then use it as a base for the speaking task, right? So for the speaking and the text map, we need to create an evaluation rubric that includes content features and language features, because we are looking at content-based language assessment. Okay, and then as teachers, we have to also decide the weight to be given to each component. So if it is a language course, we can make it 50-50, while in a content course, it can be 60-40, 70-30, as you find it suitable. There is no one rule of the thumb. But if it is within a content course and you are looking at language development in the content course, you need to give some weight to the language, but definitely more weight has to be given to the content learning and the expression of that learning. So this is how we will be ensuring that we are using learning-oriented assessment and the features of TBLT, because we are our choice of items are in the format of tasks. They are not in isolated items like fixed response or limited response. Okay, so moving on, I would give you 2 minutes. Okay, read this slide. This is the text that I have chosen, which is at the B2 level, and then we will proceed. Take a little time, 2-3 minutes to read. There are 2 slides on the text, so take a little time to read the text.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay, so if you have read the text, you might have got the impression, that it is a simple text. So if you look at the first 2-3 sentences, they are very simple, right? But if you look at sentences like, it can usually be assumed that the longer you wish to travel, the more expensive and time consuming it would be. Or, if the journey is a long distance, people may choose to sleep on ferry, etc., etc. So when I, use this text to analyze its difficulty through 2 sources of the text analyzer and CEFR checker, what I found out was the text is at the B2 level, okay, but the sentences are at the C1 level. So this is very interesting, that although the theme might look easy, but the linguistic structure of the sentences and the vocabulary use pushes the level of the text to a level higher. And the CEFR checker also gives you the sentences which are at the C1 level. So if you wish to do some discrete item, test on the basis of this text, a good strategy would be to pick and choose those sentences and turn them into testing points. But that I'm not discussing now. So let's move on. So when we wish to look at content-based language assessment, the first one of the very important things that a teacher could resort to is, along with CEFR, look at the revised Bloom's taxonomy, right? And look at the cognitive domain and the affective domain and see where it stands. So, for example, in the cognitive domain, the assessment that I would be designing on the basis of this text. Now I have chosen the text, I've analyzed its difficulty level. Now I have to see how my tasks would look like. So I can move from comprehension, application, analysis to higher level. And at the same time, I would also have to consider what is the learner going to feel in order to do this task. So do they have to share their opinion? Do they have to value somebody's? So if it is a group discussion, do they have to value somebody's opinion? Do they have to, respond to a task? So these are the affective features that the learners would have to, resort to. So it's not only the cognitive linguistic domain, but we also need to think of the affective domain. And it's not easy, like, traversing between the two. But when we design our assessment, we need to know that these add to the complexity level of the, task response. Okay, so what we will do is now look at the concept of text mediation. Okay, now this is a skill of reading that has been identified in the Council of Europe, or CEFR 2022, because text mediation is a skill which helps the reader, reach out to, not the reader, the writer, reach out to an audience who do not have access to the original text. right? So what they do is they mediate the text through an interpretation or a paraphrase or a summary or a record. And this is what academically in higher education students have to do over and over again. Okay. So therefore, text mediation is a very important sub-skill of reading going on to production. That could be for speaking or writing purposes. And therefore, I've chosen this. So this is how it looks diagrammatically, that we have the reception and production, reading and speaking, for example, here. And we have an interaction of the two. And the interaction of the two is formulated through the mediation. So what I have is mediation task 1 is a text map and mediation task 2 is an opinion task. So my content-based language assessment assesses the learner's ability to mediate through texts, and they do it through the modality of reading and speaking. So let's see how it looks like. So the text map, creating a summary map of key ideas. So this is how the text map would look like. You can take a minute to look at it. Okay, so here you can notice that usually we don't need to use sentences. We don't need to compose a text. We have to identify the key ideas and linguistically express them through a number of phrases. So as a teacher, I then need to create an assessment rubric for text map. So what I can do is create a simple checklist, that key ideas to be identified, guided by. So this is a, it is an example text map. Of course, your students' text maps will differ from this. So they may or may not be able to, identify all the ideas or all the links. So this you can use as a benchmark to, look at their responses and place them at a particular grade. So we could look for key ideas. We could look at the ability of the learners to look at the links established. So is it an additive link? So these are additive links where there are different examples given. Is it kind of, can be fun, may not be fun. So is it a contrastive link? Are there subtypes? Are there causal links? So on and so forth. And what is the language? So this is the content part of the text map. 1 and 2. Third is language, where we look at the language component of the text map. So what are the phrases the learners have used? Have they used them appropriately? Are they accurate? So we need to look at the part of speech of the phrases, So there are a number of modals, can be fun, can be costly, can be affordable. There could be some adjectival phrases that people can suffer from travel sickness, adjectival or adverbial phrases. Traveling abroad for holiday. Right? So we can look at the phrases used and, their grammaticality and their variety in terms of parts of speech. So note that this is a receptive skill going on to a limited production task, right? So the answers will differ, but they will not entirely differ because they have to rotate around the key ideas and the links that have been established. So where you will find a lot of, difficulty in gauging their, level is the kind of phrases that they have used. So you could check for their grammaticality and the variety, the spread of part of speech phrases that they have used. Okay, so the assessment rubrics must focus on filtering key ideas, the links drawn through the text map, insertion of key phrases, and estimated by their appropriacy and variety. Okay, so here the degree of text mediation is more on text language selection. We don't need to do anything with the language, but we need to select the language and prepare for my next task. Okay, so this is an example of lower level language mediation task. Then we move on to the next task. Look at the task here. Read the text and express your opinion on benefits and challenges of traveling to a new place. Okay, so it is a group work. Discuss your opinion with your group members. So for this kind of a task, what is the kind of assessment rubrics that I can prepare? So here I have used an example of self-assessment checklist, which can also be used by the tutor or the peers. Okay, so first we look at, the content features and the organizational features, and then we look at the language features, grammar and vocabulary. And lastly, we look at the affective features. So the affective features are coming from this bit of the Bloom's taxonomy. So look at the cognitive features, linguistic features, and the affective features. And thereby we draw this kind of an assessment, criteria. So don't get too overwhelmed. If you wish, if you want to, I will share the slides, not an issue. Okay, so we have the content bit and we have the, language bit. So we divide it consciously. It doesn't matter. I can do it as a content teacher or as a language teacher. But I need to have this orientation that it has to be divided between content assessment versus language assessment. That is very important. And because this is a group discussion task where I have to share my views, people have to value my opinion, they can contradict, they can politely reject. So I also need to look at the affective factors, that how it will impact others or the peers in the group. Okay, so this is how I can build the assessment criteria. So quickly concluding that when we think of the content-based language assessment, we need to maintain the balance. So teachers need to identify the amount of content knowledge that a task can generate and assess, and then consider how it needs to be linguistically expressed or mediated through the language. Okay, so I have consciously looked at the concept of text mediation for this, assessment example, because it relates to the curriculum needs of higher education learners. Right? Then the teachers need to identify the level of cognitive difficulty of the task, right? And assess the output of the learners accordingly. So using the RBT along with the CEFR is a good, starting point for the teachers. Then they have to assign weight to content versus language. So this is applicable for both content teachers as well as language teachers. And the greatest challenge is to assess content and language. Subject teachers need to know a little bit about language assessment and the other way around, right? So how can we strike a balance? A balancing act can be maintained if we have healthy debates, dialogues between content and language teachers to understand how the content teachers can assess language in their classroom and the language teachers can assess content, right? Because both are complementary strands for tracking growth in learners. I'm sure you would agree to that. Right? And to create a condition for assessment for learning or the formative assessment, we need to, prepare our assessment criteria, like I showed you of the text map and the speaking task very carefully, and then take it to the next level. We should be able to share it with our learners so that they know what are my expectations from them based on a particular task. And also use it to give feedbacks. Now, how to use it to give feedback, I'm not discussing today, but it can be used as a very, very potential, robust tool for giving learners feedback to move along the path of development. So I would end with a small quote from a book which is on content-based language assessment. So you can take a minute to read through the quote to understand the teacher-student balance. So on one hand, we have the content teacher, language teacher balance, and on another hand, we have the teacher-student balance to, make the model of content-based language assessment successful. Right? So it pays a lot of attention to the concept of feedback or feed forward, and the creation of the assessment as a formative tool for assessment. Right, so I'll end with this. These are my references. And so the text map, I used this MindMaster, but these are, resources for you as teachers. I'm sure many of you are already using them. If you are not, you could access them and create your sample text map and use it to, gauge the level of improvement in your learners' responses.